How to dual boot Windows XP and Windows 7. Is there any way you can install Microsoft Windows XP operating system on your personal computer, you ask? You have a 250 gigabyte hard drive running Windows 7 and your hard drive isn't partitioned. Are you wanting to dual boot Windows XP and Windows 7, or are you wanting to remove Windows 7 and replace that with Windows XP? What steps have you already tried? You want to dual boot both operating systems. You haven't tried anything yet, as you do not want anything detrimental to happen to your PC. You have vital information on it and you don't want to reformat or make PC recovery disks. It is possible to dual boot Windows XP and Windows 7 after Windows 7 was installed first. Please follow this how to set up a dual boot installation with Windows 7 and XP tutorial. Skip to option 2 when Windows 7 is first installed. I will include a link to this blog post on my website anetcomputers.com in this YouTube video description so that you can access this web link to Windows 7 forums. We will skip to option 2. Dual booting is just basically you have an option. You can either boot into Windows 7 operating system or Windows XP operating system. That's what that term means, dual booting. You can boot multiple operating systems off the same hard drive. You just create separate partitions for each operating system. So let's get down to option 2. When Windows 7 is installed first, there's a warning about RAID setup and a warning about SATA drive. Number 1, to create a new partition from the Windows 7 hard disk. If you want to install XP on a separate internal hard drive, skip that step. If you're wanting to install Windows XP on the same hard drive, in Windows 7, select and shrink the Windows 7 volume in disk management by how many megabytes. 1024 megabytes equals 1 gigabyte you want to have for this XP partition. See screenshots below. Note, you would do all of the method 1 at that link. If we look at this screenshot, this is this individual's hard drive. It has a 100 megabyte NTFS boot partition. You don't want to mess with that. It has a Windows 7C 80 gigabyte NTFS partition. You want to shrink this. You could just, with quick, easy math, convert it into two 40 gigabyte partitions. One 40 gig partition for Windows 7, a second 40 gig partition for Windows XP. So you want to shrink this in half. And you do that by using disk management. I wish it took me back exactly to that screenshot. There's another screenshot. You see where they created the second 40 gigabyte partition. It's unallocated. And then now they allocated it for Windows XP. So they created a second partition. You have 3 partitions now. One for the boot partition. You don't want to mess with that. A second has Windows 7. A third has Windows XP. 3 partitions for 2 operating systems. Number 2, insert your XP installation disk, then restart the computer and press any key to boot from it when prompted. Make sure that the CD/DVD drive is selected first in the boot order in the BIOS, or some computer manufacturers have a boot menu. I think Lenovo is F11 or F12, and I think Dell is F12. It takes you to a boot menu where you get to choose a device to boot from. So boot off your CD or DVD drive from XP setup, press enter. Another warning about RAID setup and SATA drive. You'll come to the blue welcome to Windows XP professional setup. Press F8 to acknowledge the license agreement. So this is the very important right here. Select the partition, step 1, or hard drive that you want to install XP on using the arrow keys and press enter. This is the 3rd partition you created. Remember above, using disk management, you created a 3rd partition, 40 gigabytes, and you labeled it Windows XP. You select that. That's where you're going to install Windows XP. Windows 7 is already installed. The system partition, the 100 megabyte, that's the boot partition. You don't want to mess with that. You don't want to choose that one. You want to choose this 3rd partition. And then finish installing XP. If you have any problems loading XP, there's 3 commands here on screen that you can run at a command prompt. Now step 8. This is where you are going to change the boot order on the boot partition. You use a utility run easy bct. Note this is required to repair the Windows 7 boot file and add XP to the Windows Boot Manager list. Follow these instructions. It even has screenshots. Step 9, step 10, and then right to the MBR. Just follow these instructions on how to add Windows XP to the boot manager. Right now, when you boot up, you'll only see Windows 7 as an option. Using BCD and following step A, B, C, D, adding an entry, step 10, then writing it to the MBR, now you will have a second choice. Close EEZ BCD, restart the computer to have the option to boot from Windows XP or Windows 7. Here's the screenshot. Before, you only had Windows 7 as an option because you only had Windows 7 installed on one partition. Now you have two separate partitions, one for Windows 7, a second for Windows XP, and now that you edited and added Windows XP to the boot partition, you will see that in the Windows Boot Manager. So now you can dual boot. Now every time you start up your computer, you can either select Windows 7 or Windows XP or whichever operating system you choose. You can certainly try this with Windows Vista 8, 10, and even Linux. And that's it. If you have any problems, I highly recommend that you just read this article from Windows 7 forums in its entirety. It even has troubleshooting steps if you run into any problems. Adios.